Well, as we go to air tonight, ISIS, the fanatical Islamist group Tony Abbott prefers to call the death cult, is facing its first significant military defeat in northern Iraq. These are pictures of the Iraqi forces entering the outskirts of the city of Tikrit, the birthplace and stronghold of the old dictator Saddam Hussein. Well, we care about this because the power of ISIS has grown unchecked in key cities in northern Iraq since its fighters swarmed across the border from Syria in June last year. And we care because the Prime Minister announced last week he's sending 300 more troops to bolster the 170 special forces already in Iraq to retrain the country's demoralised military.
It is a mission which is necessary because obviously in the face of the initial death cult onslaught, the Iraqi regular army melted like snow in summer.
So here's a key question. If the Iraqi army is so useless, how are they on the verge of routing ISIS from a major centre for the first time? The answer comes in part from this man. He's the leader of the Badr Shia militia, a better disciplined force than the army, which is doing some of the hardest fighting in the battle for Tikrit, and who are working with and being directed by Iranian military advisors.
Yes, we declare to the world we have Iranian advisors, he says, and we're proud of them, and we thank them deeply for participating with us because Iran has more experience than anyone else on earth in fighting terrorism.
And there's the rub for us and for our American allies. These Iraqi Shias are just far more comfortable working with their Iranian brothers than with the US-led coalition. Naturally, this worries our American friends.
We are all concerned about what happens after the drums stop beating and ISIL is defeated, and whether the government of Iraq will remain on a path to provide an inclusive government for all of the various groups within it. We're very concerned about that.
The man they're most worried about is this fellow. He's the Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani. He's one of Iran's most powerful men, and as the former Iraqi vice president told us last year, one of the most dangerous.
He is actually the person behind instigating of instability, sectarian violence in Iraq.
Well, to describe what's going on, the Wall Street Journal has this simple headline: Iran occupies Iraq. So what exactly are we sending Australian troops into? Will they end up having to follow the lead of Iranian military commanders? And where is the battle against ISIS likely to go? Here's the city of Tikrit, and as you can see, it's 160 kilometres north of Baghdad. But the real objective lies much further north. It is Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq and the key stronghold of ISIS. Well, to help us understand what lies ahead, we're joined now by Michael Pregent. He lived in Mosul 2005 and 6 as an embedded advisor to the Kurdish Peshmerga. Until 2011, he was a US Defence Department advisor to Iraq. He's now a lecturer at the National Defence University in Washington. He joins us now in our Washington studio. Thanks for being there.
Hey, thank you for having me this morning.
Now,
this morning in D.C.
Yes, indeed. Now, you write that you actually saw with your own eyes the United States enabling an Iranian takeover of Iraq. Let's start there. How did that happen?
Well, my first view into that was I was asked in 2005 by some Shia militia men who were part of the Badr Corps in a unit called the Wolf Brigade in Mosul, whether I was for the Shia or for the Sunni. And I asked them, what do you mean exactly? He says, are you for the Sunni? And they would say, Kul Sunni irhabin, all the Sunnis are terrorists. Or are you for the Shia? And of course, being embedded with them initially, I said, let's go kill some terrorists. Let's fight some terrorists. So that was my first glimpse. And then I worked with the Peshmerga in Mosul, and we saw a very effective unit that was able to conduct counterinsurgency operations in Mosul. And what we started seeing is wherever they have familial, tribal, or political ties, they're very willing to fight. Absent those ties, they do a lot like what we saw in June 2014 when ISIS rode into Mosul. The ISF moved back to areas they were more comfortable fighting in, and they happened to be Shia. So I had a glimpse of northern Iraq. I went down to Baghdad and had no idea of the growing Shia militia presence in Baghdad with Jaish al-Mahdi, with Badr Corps, and some other Shia militia groups that had heavy sway over the Iraqi government.
Yep. So what was the role, because I'm sure you must have heard of him, of the Iranian Major General Soleimani we were just talking about in all of this, because he seems to be orchestrating much of this change.
What's interesting about Soleimani is when we were there in Iraq, a report of Soleimani being in Iraq, he was like a ghost, was wake-up criteria for a U.S. president. Now, he's basically leading victory parades after the seizure of towns from ISIS. So you have a figure who was wake-up criteria for a U.S. president during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, and now a tacit ally in Iraq. And you have to understand how alienating this personality is to the Sunni community. The presence of Iranian Quds Force working with Shia militias moving in the Sunni areas pushes Sunnis into a natural default position into armed resistance. That doesn't mean they go work for ISIS or join ISIS, but their default position is to fight against Shia incursions in the Sunni areas, as well as, especially if they're backed by Iranian Quds Force lieutenants and generals.
I've got to ask you, what do US military generals think about this? Because it's not so long ago that the Iranians were called by the president the axis of evil. Now we seem to be fighting alongside them, and the forces we're training are actually under their command.
The first time I briefed General Dempsey and General Dubek and General Petraeus was 2005-2006, when I started looking at the shift in the Iraqi security forces, the makeup. In Baghdad, there were 55% Shia, 45% Sunni in 2005. In 2006, that changed from 90% Shia to 10% Sunni. They were basically kicking out effective Sunni commanders that were willing to go after not only al-Qaeda, but these Shia militias and these Iranian-backed militias as well. Well, that was what was used to basically remove them from the Iraqi security forces. So I talked to General Dubek and General Dempsey. We briefed them about the composition. And I asked them, are you aware that there's Shia militia infiltration and growth in the Iraqi security forces? And I was basically told, we don't ask them whether they're Shia or Sunni, we just ask them if they're Iraqi. And that was the problem. We don't feel comfortable asking what their sect is when they join the Iraqi security forces. They're very much aware of who the Sunnis are. We should be aware as well, because the imbalance in the Iraqi security forces led to this permissive environment. And we pretty much ignored it. We said Shia militiamen is an ally in the fight against al-Qaeda. We were saying that in 2006. Thinking that if al-Qaeda was defeated, the Shia militias would simply put down their arms. That hasn't happened. They just grew stronger, and then they grew stronger politically as well, as they started developing political wings to keep the militias in force, and also be able to advocate for their inclusion in the Iraqi security forces.
Now, just explain for us, if you can, the connection between the Shia militias and the Iranian advisors, so-called, and the Iranian commanders from the Al-Quds Brigade and from the Revolutionary Guard.
The relationship, basically these Shia militias were actually being trained in Iran during the Saddam regime. And they developed close relationships with Soleimani's Quds Force. After the 2003 invasion, the Badr Corps, which is basically, you talked about Hadi al-Amiri at the beginning of the show. He was a Badr Corps commander, the senior Badr Corps commander. When we came in 2003, Badr Corps basically rolled in behind us and very convincingly told American generals and American diplomats that we are here to help you fight the Ba'athist threat and also fight al-Qaeda. So we picked a horse early on, and that was Badr Corps and Hakim Skiri of the Supreme Council Revolutionary Council of Iraq, but a closely tied Iranian political party. We picked a horse early. They were a very strong advocate against al-Qaeda, and as you mentioned, as forces go into Iraq now, you're going to find a very capable Iraqi security force and Shia militia partner in fighting ISIS. The problem is they're going to say every Sunni military-age male is ISIS or an ISIS collaborator, and that's the issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, and beyond that, it's the extension of the power and influence of Iran into Iraq. I mean, how profound is that going to be? What are the strategic implications of that?
Well, Maliki was a compromise candidate in 2006, so he basically couldn't do anything without the approval of Shia political parties in Iran. He grew into that strongman that Iraq has shown that it's needed throughout its history. Abedi is now that marginalized candidate. He is Maliki 2006. He doesn't have the political power to push back against the Shia militias or the Shia political parties, and he's beholden to those parties and their Iranian supporters. So Iran now, when we have the Prime Minister of Iraq saying that Iran is a constructive partner in this fight against ISIS and that Soleimani comes and goes as he pleases, it is very telling. It basically says the Iranians can do what they want to do, and they have a 2-year license under this administration to do everything they can because they know that there will be no constraints on them because this nuke deal is so important that we're not using our leverage to constrain Iranian influence in Iraq, and especially we need to stay the Shia militias. They can protect Shia areas, Shia mosques, Shia shrines, but the more they push into Sunni areas, the more they're going to push Sunnis into armed resistance.
Yeah, Michael, that does sound like a kind of continuing spiral of violence, as we've seen before. Let me ask you this. What is the significance of this power shift for what's going on right now? Because we're seeing the attempt, and it could be successful, to retake Tikrit. It would be the first big loss for ISIS, and yet the US is not involved in it. The US is not providing air support. It's the Iranians who are doing that, and on the ground direction from their military commanders.
Well, what has actually happened is the Iraqi security forces are being subjugated to these Iranian-backed Shia militia members. But what does happen, and what happened in Jafar al-Sakhr, was the Shia militias will go forward, and then they'll talk to the Iraqi security forces and say, hey, call the Americans, have them bomb that house over there. So we think that's an ISIS stronghold. So we do provide close air support, and those orders come from the Iraqi security forces. So that's a legitimate line of communications with a legitimate force. However, they're being asked by Shia militia members and Quds Force generals that, hey, call the Americans and have them bomb that place. Anytime we look like we're complicit in the indiscriminate targeting of Sunnis has a negative effect in the Sunni population, the same population we need to fight ISIS. You can't take Mosul back without Sunnis. Tikrit is an operation, but most of the Sunni population has already been pushed out. And my biggest concern is who will label them collaborators. That is concerning because they will be labeled collaborators by Shia militias, and they will be labeled collaborators by Quds Force. This isn't just an ISIS operation. This is Iran's operation to ensure there is no Sunni threat from Iraq that will ever jeopardize Iranian stability.
Michael Prejean, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much. There's obviously much more to talk about. We'll come back to you as this unfolds, I'm sure.
Thank you for having me.